Hey everybody, this is Miss McKeever today, and we're gonna take a bit of a side note away from the Enlightenment today. There's another movement that's taking place during this period of time that I want to get everyone kind of caught up on, because it's going to play a major role in things in the future here, and also kind of reflects what's going on in the Enlightenment as well too. But it is not the Enlightenment. It's kind of a product really of the scientific revolution. So let's talk about the agricultural revolution. All right, so we have to take this moment to really talk about how Europe just refused to make any advances when it comes to agriculture for hundreds upon hundreds of years. We pretty much are using the same practices to farm at this point in European history as we were in the Dark Ages. And the reality is the population can't support it anymore. Once upon a time, we had this thing called the bubonic plague that came and wiped out a huge portion of the population. That relieved the stress on food production. Well, that time has passed. The European population has rebounded, and this is going to be a challenge for Europe to deal with. So there isn't a lot of movement, and people are going to be reluctant. It's also important to remember that the farther east you get, the more and more this is an issue. Places like France or England are going to be pretty quick to adapt and change when change takes place. Whereas when you get to Austria and Russia, places like that, they are very reluctant to ever make any changes. So they're going to fall behind quite a bit pretty early on here. And then also, it's important to realize that this is going to be a struggle, or at least an interesting period for European landowners. At first, they don't want this, but eventually, they are going to actually look at this as an opportunity to really grow and accumulate more wealth. So, interesting situation in Europe during this period. But the reality is, everything has to adjust because there's just too many people in Europe. The family is the base unit at home, but families are being forced to deal with less, or having less resources. And this is going to have an impact on European society. Families start having children later. Families start doing things to control the population of their children, which is going to have a lot of possibly unintended consequences on European society. So what are all the different changes? Well, one, you did not start, how do I want to put this? Physically connecting in your marriage after a child is born until you stopped breastfeeding. For many families, this was putting a, somewhere between 2 and 4 year gap in between children, which is kind of the normal situation in modern societies today. But at this time, that's dramatically slowing down how many children you would have. Up to this point in time, families were having 6, 7, 8 children over the course of their lifetime. Well, now we're cutting that down to maybe 3 or 4. That's a huge change. This was because breastfeeding was the easiest and cheapest way to feed children. So you did it longer because you didn't have to feed them as much, and it didn't cost as much for the family. So all these things are playing a part into just really creating a much smaller social unit in Europe. Well, this becomes a challenge in and of itself as well. What do you do with this? The Enlightenment is also going to have this impact of really valuing the importance of childhood and how children should have clothing that is appropriate to their gender, how we should not be just giving everything to the firstborn of a family. There should be some more equitable distribution of wealth and of land to various people in the family. Also, what happens when you have a kid that you can't afford to have? Up to this point in European history, people just kind of abandoned those children, or they got rid of them. Infanticide becomes pretty significant. Well, the Enlightenment no longer says that's acceptable, and you have to actually take care of your children. So if you couldn't take care of them yourself, you put them in an institution, foundling institutions that are effectively orphanages for unwanted kids. And most kids do die in these situations. They are not great. They are not well funded or anything. So that's now playing a role in things. All of this is resulting in much smaller families. People are marrying older. Less children are taking place. Women are becoming, or at least staying single more often. And birth control becomes a thing. What's important to remember then is why they were having these large families to begin with. Well, that was to work a farm. And if you go from having 7 employees to 2 or 3, that's going to impact how much you can farm. And this changes things. Bread prices start to increase. There is less bread because families aren't producing as much food. Peasants then can't afford to pay for this. So it's spiraling more and more out of control. And this is where it becomes an opportunity for landowners. For them, they have the ability to create the food that people want, so the prices are higher. That's great and wonderful. Where the actual value comes is when you start changing the actual way that we produce the food. And this is what we call the agricultural revolution. Due to the scientific revolution, we now start to realize that there are ways to create food better than the ways that we've been using. We know we need it, so let's start doing it. So they come up with really 4 different ways to increase the food supply in Europe. Well, one, they're going to introduce new crops. Crops that are going to be high in nitrogen that really helps benefit the soil. Crops like turnips, like beets, like clover. These are going to be incredibly useful for rejuvenating the soil after a long growing season. They invent new tools such as the seed drill and the reaper to not only improve the actual planting of the soil or planting of the plants in the soil, but also the collection of the plant upon harvest. They're developing tools that allow less people to have to do the job. Less farmers are needed. Which is perfect because now we get the enclosure movement, the creation of much larger commercial farms, where the small mom-and-pop family farm that has been running Europe for the last few hundred years and really feeding everyone doesn't really work anymore. The families don't have enough people to run the farms anymore. They only have 2 or 3 kids. Due to all the things that have kind of boiled up to this point, changes in how people feel about children, challenges with higher bread prices, women breastfeeding longer, contraceptive purposes or procedures taking place. All of these things are really opening the door for large landowners to buy more land. They give a chunk of money to a family who's desperate for money because they can't afford food, and then they get huge chunks of land that they can now use in a system called crop rotation, where they start allocating various fields to different crops to keep the soil from ever becoming inert. Food production skyrockets, and the farmers begin to wander. They don't have anywhere to go. Cities aren't a thing yet. That's a little bit down the line still. So if you have large populations in Europe just starting to wander around, how is this going to be a thing? Well, of course, there's going to be riots. There's going to be people who are upset. The enclosure movement is going to take the land that had existed to farmers and really take it all away. Their livelihoods are gone. So people are upset. Eastern Europe sees significant rise of peasant revolts, most famous of which is going to be Pugachev's rebellion during the time of Catherine the Great. So this leads to change and overpopulation. Europe is going to grow at a tremendous rate during the era of the 18th century. At 1700, Europe had roughly 100 million people. By the time the century ends, 260 million. That's insane. And it's because of these changes, the increased production of food, like the potato, introduced now to European economies. Societies are radically changing what types of food they're producing, what they're using it for, and Europe is forever changing. Women are now freed up. They don't have to work on a farm anymore. They can come up with other talents and use other skills. And what we have are people joining things called cottage industries. Home kind of like your home version of an Etsy minus the website. You bake crafts, you make things, you make baskets or clothes, sew things, whatever it is. You can make some money for your family, which I guess is a little bit of progress for women in their role in society at this point. But unfortunately, they just don't make a lot of money doing that. So if you're a woman who desperately needed money, you're still kind of stuck going to the oldest profession in the world. But society's now radically changed because of this change in food production that comes out during this period. It's part of a reflection of the changes in values that come out of the Enlightenment, that you can't just kind of toss aside your children anymore, that you should be more responsible in the decisions that you make. Things have changed. And this is all setting us up. It's setting us up for probably the single most important era of human history because people need things. You have this huge population in Europe that's just growing at a stupid level. You have children who now need to have clothes that differentiates their gender. You have jobs for all these people who no longer work on farms. You need some basic services for these people. All of these things require Europe itself to massively go through a change. They can't live the way they've been living because it's just not possible anymore. So this is going to be the kick we need to bring us to the Industrial Revolution. Life in Europe is changing dramatically. It's a bit of a reflection of the changes in values that take place during the Enlightenment, and definitely a reflection of the changes in how we understand how food production works thanks to the scientific revolution. And the end result is Europe is on a crash course revolution. It has to change how it works, otherwise everyone dies. And the product of what they create is the reason why we're able to have these videos today. Thanks and have a great day.